measures that you should have in place to keep that information secure. So the GDPR talks in terms of risks to the individuals whose that personal data relates to, essentially. So you can imagine information like financial data, like health information. The risks around that type of information getting lost or being disclosed to an unauthorized third party, those risks are quite great. So for that reason, the measures you should have in place for that more sensitive data are more robust than for maybe more routine and maybe publicly available data. Now, the GDPR splits down those measures into organizational measures, which includes policies and training. And I'm going to spend a little bit of time later on talking more in depth about those two things. And also technical measures. Now, technical measures are really things for your IT team or your IT experts to be thinking about. So they're your kind of, your bread and butter technical things. You've got your firewalls, you've got your antivirus software, you've got your encryption, that kind of thing. So those technical measures I would expect to be dealt with by your IT team. It's the organizational measures which we're going to be focusing on a bit more today, because we as lawyers tend to advise a bit more on those organizational measures. Next slide, please, Emma. Brilliant. So I dropped in the phrase there, personal data. But it's always good to think about actually what is the definition of personal data, because in my experience, there are quite a lot of myths around what personal data actually is. So for example, I will sometimes speak to clients and they'll say to me, oh, well, this information can't be personal data because it's, I don't know, it's already known to people, or it's not particularly confidential. That's actually not the case. So personal data is any information which relates to an identified or an identifiable living person. So this can be all sorts of things. The reason I put or identifiable in brackets there is that even if somebody's name is not connected with the information on the face of it, if it's possible for a reasonably determined person to be able to piece together different pieces of information and work out who the information relates to, that still counts as personal data. Now, it's really important to understand what personal data is, because if you don't understand what personal data is, data protection law won't really make a lot of sense, because data protection law, GDPR, Data Protection Act 2018 in the case of the UK, is to do with the regulation of personal data, it's to do with protecting personal data. So your organizations will hold a whole host of different types of personal data across all your different teams, all your different service channels, in all different formats. So, CCTV footage might be personal data if you can work out who the individuals are in there. Same with photos. And now we're all communicating by lots of different means as well. So, we've got WhatsApp, we've got email, we've got Slack, whatever else we're using to communicate. Any data in there that relates to an individual, from which that individual can be identified or identifiable, that's personal data. So these obligations I'm talking about when I'm talking about keeping personal data secure, that applies to all those different formats, which is why it can be quite a challenging area. Next slide, please, Emma. So I'm going to focus very briefly on some of the key things to be thinking about. In a webinar of this length, it's not possible to go through everything you might need to be thinking about. Also, the things that you as an organisation will need to be thinking about will vary from, another delegate that's attending this same webinar, because it does depend on the type of personal data you hold. It depends on how you work as well. So these are the common areas that I would expect all organisations to be thinking about. So technical measures to start with. So as I said, that's the type of measures for your IT team. That's going to include the obvious things like backing up your data. We are seeing an increase in what are called ransomware attacks. Now, you may remember a few years ago, the NHS were victim to what was referred to as the WannaCry virus. And that was a ransomware attack. So what happens is a hacker will access your data and they will hold it to ransom, and they will ask you to pay a sum of money to unencrypt it so you can get it back. So that's why it's vital that you back up your data, or one of the many reasons why it's vital to back up your data. I put down here as well antivirus software, firewalls, patching. Patching is when you update your software and hardware so that you've got the security, the latest security measures in place for those. So these are the type of things I would expect your IT team to be thinking about on an almost, you know, daily basis. They're the really key things. Two-factor authentication is an interesting one. This is increasingly being used, particularly around home working. It's where you need two pieces of information to access the system. So you'll probably use two-factor authentication for your online banking. So you put in your login details, but they'll also ask you to generate a code of some description, maybe using the app on your phone. You input that randomly generated code as well, just to provide an extra measure of security. So that's something worth bearing in mind if you're not yet using two-factor authentication. Maybe worth speaking to your IT team about that. Organizational measures. So they include staff training, guidance for staff, and policies. And I'll do a section later this morning on those three things. I want to take a moment to talk about passwords now, though, because passwords, strong passwords, are really the low-hanging fruit of information security. It's so simple to have a good, strong password that it can protect you against a multitude of different risks. So make sure your staff are trained on what is a strong password. The National Cybersecurity Centre advised stringing together 3 words which are unconnected to make a memorable but long password. So the key is we want the passwords to be long but memorable, because we want to avoid people having to write them down. Over the last few years, I've come across a number of clients who have suffered data breaches because they've had an employee who has put the password on a post-it note and then stuck it on their computer monitor, or written the password down and then lost it. So just make sure, you know, these really simple things can be so crucial. Passwords as well. Your staff should not be using passwords for work they use for their personal online shopping, for example. Because if let's say they use the same password for accessing their work emails as they do for the Amazon shopping, well, if Amazon gets hacked and that password is compromised, that could then compromise your systems as well. Next slide, please, Emma. Right, I wanted to take a little bit of time this morning specifically to talk about scams and phishing, because as I mentioned, we are seeing an increase in the number of phishing attacks. Cyber criminals in particular are unfortunately exploiting the COVID-19 pandemic. A few months ago, the World Health Organization noted that they were seeing a number of fake emails purporting to be from them, which are actually phishing emails. So we're seeing an increase in the number of scams. Just out of, just of interest, there is a new service actually started by the government called the Suspicious Email Reporting Service. So if you do receive a phishing email and you spot it's a phishing email, you can send it to that email address so that the government can then, or the Cybersecurity Centre can then build up a database of these type of attacks. Next slide, please, Emma. So I've thrown in that phrase phishing emails as if you would all know what I'm talking about. So a phishing email is essentially, it's phishing for information. It's phishing for passwords, login details. It's phishing for you to click on a link, that kind of thing. You may have, I thought quite a popular, well, I say popular, quite a widespread phishing email was the one from purporting to come from the TV license service. You may have all received that. So it's basically asking you to click on a link or give them some information. Now, some of the signs of a phishing email are that they will play on your emotions. It will demand a quick response. So it might be purporting to come from your bank, for example, and it might say, you need to transfer all your money urgently to this safe haven, for example, or, you know, it might be something purporting to come from your boss, for example, saying, I urgently need to click on this link to do some urgent work for me, that kind of thing. Sometimes the English is not perfect in the email, so that can be a telltale sign. But also the sender's email address might look slightly strange because they will try and pretend to be a more reputable organization. So they might put an extra dot somewhere, so it does look slightly strange. So, you know, it comes from HSBC, but the S looks slightly strange, that kind of thing. It's probably not going to be addressed to you personally unless it's what's called a whaling attack, which is where it is specifically targeted at you. So it might be addressed dear customers, for example. And as I said, it will ask you to do something. So click on a link, open an attachment, provide login details, because that gives the hacker access to your computer, to your work systems, that kind of thing. Unfortunately, they are becoming increasingly difficult to spot. But it's really worth being on your guard about this and making sure that this type of guidance on how to spot phishing emails is built into any staff training and staff policies that you have. I'm going to pass on now to my colleague Vicki, who's going to talk about some home working.
Thanks, Claire. So Claire's talked a bit about security measures and things in general, and I'm going to talk about that in the context of actual home working, as we are all now doing. So if you pop the first slide on, Emma, that would be great. So obviously we've all been working from home for a while now, and at the start of the pandemic it felt almost overnight. Suddenly that's it, you can't come into the office, and there's a big panic, and we all had to get set up to work from home, and there were lots of decisions being made very quickly to keep people working, and that's fine. And those decisions won't have gone into as much detail as you would normally, because normally you have time to think about these things and implement policies, etc. We're a little way in now, so I think now, if you haven't already, is a really good time to start reviewing your arrangements, particularly because as our organisation and lots of organisations are now talking about the future, regardless of the pandemic. I think there is a definite acceptance that actually we all can work from home and the world doesn't collapse, we do carry on. So I think more and more people are going to be working from home and asking to work with us in the future. So you need to make sure that not only can you do it right now in the face of the pandemic, but what are you going to do in the future when you're getting those requests, and making sure that actually the systems you've got in place are the right systems, and you've got that time now to think about it. So the first question that you would have asked and that you need to ask again is, are your staff actually set up to work from home securely? So what equipment are they using? Are they using their own equipment? I'm using my own laptop today, for example, or are they using equipment that's been provided by you? And obviously there's a security benefit to them using equipment provided by you, because you can set antivirus software on there, you can set password requirements on there, etc. But that comes with a really considerable cost, so you have to weigh those things up. One of the ways to get around that, and the way that we use at BWB, is that whilst I'm using my own laptop, I'm accessing my work systems through Citrix. So no actual BWB information is on my personal device. And we have two-factor authentication when we go in. So in fact, I have to put in 3 different passwords or codes in order to get from opening my laptop to getting to the work system. So there's that level of security. And one of the other questions that's come out, and I think more so later and not so much at the beginning, is what about hard copy information? And I think it's so we're talking here about information that contains personal data, so you have those requirements to make sure that that information is secure, is destroyed securely, but you will have other confidential information and other sensitive information that people might have in hard copy that you actually want them to get rid of in a secure manner. So I'm a bit old school, so I like notebooks, so I have hundreds of bits of paper on my desk. I shut them away in the evening. I appreciate I'm at home, but I'm also a data protection lawyer, so I make sure that they're cleared away so that nobody can see them. And when I need to get rid of them, I have to make sure that I get rid of them in a secure way. My personal shredder is not a secure manner. It's not as secure as the one we use at work. So you have to think about, okay, if my staff have got sensitive or personal information in hard copy form, how are we asking them to destroy it? Again, it's okay, do we provide them with shredders? Do we ask them to send the information back to us? Then there's, of course, there's the risk that it gets lost in transit. But have you thought about how they're destroying the information? Have you thought about how you're going to get rid, how you're going to help that? There is no perfect solution. And again, it's a matter of weighing up the risks and weighing up the cost and all of those things. And of course, the sensitivity of the information itself, and working through the best way to do it. As an aside, probably don't ask your staff to burn their information. That's what I do with my personal. I'm a governor and I always burn my papers to make sure they're destroyed. And last summer I set fire to my neighbour's fence, which they haven't worked out yet because it's actually underneath their conservatory. But just a top tip, burning you have to be quite careful with that. Right, sorry, Emma, move on to the next slide and something more serious. One of the key things with home working is actually making sure that your staff understand what's expected. So it's all very well sitting around in a little management group and thinking, right, okay, we've got these systems, the IT team have been involved, they've set all this up. But do your staff actually know what decisions you've made and how those affect them? And again, it's about communicating this in a way that affects the individual rather than giving them sort of generic statements about make sure you have a strong password. Give them some guidance on what a strong password might look like. So what security requirements do we have? Do you have two-factor authentication? Do you require passcodes for phones, for example, that are used for work purposes to be of a certain length or a certain strength, the same with the passwords? And those are the technical measures that Claire was talking about earlier. But also some guidance on issues that are specific to working from home. Shared space is a key issue and one that we get asked about a lot, and that can be tricky. I'm very lucky because my partner does a job where he has to be out in his office, or in his workspace. So he's out of the house and I'm in the house. So it's only my daughter I have to stop from interrupting me, and she's not interested in rifling through my papers anyway. So I don't have that. I personally don't have that shared space issue, but it is an issue, particularly if two of you are trying to work from home and you've got to work out those logistics. So any guidance or help you can give your staff on that. One of the key things, of course, is always locking your screen. And I'm a bit, as Claire was talking about, the passwords are low-hanging fruit. Locking your screen is long-hanging fruit as well. And I am obsessive about locking my screen if I get up for seconds. And locking your screen at home is equally as important, actually, if you might have other people in the house. I've mentioned documents. What are you doing with documents? How do people report issues as well? Because one of the key sort of differences to being at home as being in the office is you can't just wander up to someone's desk and say, oh, by the way, this has happened, or, oh, have you seen this email? Is this a phishing email? We've lost that contact. And it's much harder to pick up the phone and ask somebody where you would usually just have a general sort of chat. So have a system for reporting issues and make sure that's accessible and people know what it is and they know who to go to. And if you are using home equipment or personal emails or anything like that, make sure that you've got guidance around that so that you can control it as much as you can and try and make those things secure. Can we have the next slide, please, Emma? So the final thing I'm going to talk about with home working, unsurprisingly, is video calls, because we're all on one right now, and they absolutely exploded since people work from home. I didn't even realise there were as many different ways of video calling as I now do, and I've lost count of the number of different ones I've used and tried and all of those things. And it's great, and it's been amazing, and it's meant that we can have that face-to-face contact, but obviously there are risks as well. So have you thought about secure access to calls? And I think one of the things, again, is that at the beginning we were choosing for convenience. Now we've got some time to think about, we might be using Zoom, but is this the right product for us? Is it doing what we need? Should we change? So can we get secure access to calls? Can we need to put in a password? And there was that Zoom bombing a while ago, wasn't there? And people were popping up and hacking in. So that's when more people started using passwords. Reminding people about what's in the background. I'm well aware that my background is very cluttered, but I also know exactly what is there and what could be potentially seen if you really wanted to zoom in and have a look. And there's nothing in that background that I am concerned about people seeing, so I'm happy with that. But a reminder to people to make sure that they are aware of what's in their background and what other people can see. And also, and I'll talk about this very quickly later, but the provider will likely be a data processor for you, and so you need to make sure that you've got the right agreements in place in order to protect yourself if something does go wrong, because the provider is going to process a certain amount of personal data on your behalf. That's what I wanted to say about home working, so I'm going to pass back to Claire now. So we could have the next slide as well, please, Emma.
Thanks, Vicky, and thanks, Emma. Emma, I'll have the next slide actually, please. Brilliant, thank you. So training is the first thing I want to talk about. So training is absolutely essential. Data protection compliance is the responsibility of everybody in your organization that handles personal data. I think because there is often, or there should be, a senior person who has responsibility for managing data protection compliance, we sometimes forget that actually all of us who handle personal data on behalf of an organization are responsible for complying with the law. So this means that you must be giving your staff training. Starting by talking about types of training, actually, because I appreciate that you're really kind of thinking about the options of online training versus in-person training. Now, both have advantages. The huge benefit of online training at the moment is obviously that we are all working remotely mostly. We've got social distancing to think about. So being able to get all of your staff in a room to be able to give them data protection training at the moment probably isn't feasible. So that's one of the great things for online training. But even before COVID, before the pandemic, online training was becoming increasingly popular, I was noticing, because it means you can very much keep track of which of your staff members have done the training. They sometimes also will build in an online quiz as well into the training. In-person training, though, also has its benefits, because it means that when you're actually in the room with people, as Vicki was saying, it's easier for people to kind of raise their hand and say, but what about this, what about that? But also to make suggestions as well. And one of the really key advantages of training is that it helps to build a culture of data protection in your organization, because we don't want staff to feel like they can't come forward with suggestions. In my experience, some of the best suggestions that organizations receive over information security actually come from the people on the ground doing the work, because they're the ones nearest. They're the ones who are noticing how their colleagues are maybe leaving their papers out at night and come up with a great suggestion for how that can be changed. So there are advantages of both. Probably online training at the moment, I appreciate, is probably going to be more popular. So I've mentioned training for all staff being really important, but you should also be thinking about training for specific roles. For example, I would expect your IT team in particular to be having kind of in-depth training and constantly keeping themselves up to date with the latest security measures. But also, do your senior management have a more in-depth understanding of data protection than more junior staff members? Do your marketing team understand the specifics around marketing? I appreciate that's not information security, but it's all important to do with this culture of data protection compliance. We also want to make sure staff members feel that they can come forward and speak to somebody if they have a concern that there's been a data breach. That's really, really important, because I'll talk about in a moment or later the strict deadlines for reporting data breaches. So you need staff members to understand the importance of coming forward immediately. Next slide, please, Emma. So what to cover? So this is definitely something where we need to make sure that the training is practical. There is no point making your staff members do training that is so boring they're not going to remember it. We need to make it specific. We need to make it enjoyable, hopefully. I know that sounds strange, but if you can make it enjoyable, people are far more likely to remember the training. As I mentioned before, sometimes you can put an online quiz into this training for all staff members, which at least then shows that staff members have been paying attention to what you've been covering. There is an accountability principle in the GDPR, which means that you need to be keeping records of training as well. So let's say the worst does happen and you have a data breach. The ICO's data protection, sorry, the ICO, the Information Commission's Office, the regulator, their standard form for reporting data breaches actually asks you if the staff member involved in the breach had training within the last couple of years. So really important to make sure you've got records of which staff members have undertaken the training and when. All staff members should have induction data protection training, but we also recommend an annual refresher training as well. And as I said before, specific training on specific areas of risk for a particular role is also really crucial in making sure that you're protecting the personal data that you're responsible for looking after. Next slide, please, Emma. Brilliant. So guidance. So Vicki mentioned briefly having guidance around home working, and that's absolutely the case. I'm going to cover off a little more broadly what I think should be in the guidance that you have for staff members. Again, this needs to be specific to your organisation. So what I'm talking about are the common things I would expect to be in that guidance, but you may have specific procedures, specific areas of risk that means you need things very much tailored to what you are doing as an organisation. So as said on the slide here, similar content to the training, but slightly more detail. So the guidance document, or you might even call it a policy. So some organisations call it an information security policy. It's a document staff can turn to when they've got a question or a non-urgent issue. Don't make it too lengthy because we actually want staff members to read it. That's really key and easy to understand as well. I often get sent by clients data protection policies and guidance to look at, to check that it's, you know, all up to date and in accordance with GDPR and all that. And often I find that the policies I get sent are just, they're very theoretical and not practical. So they'll spend like 2 pages just talking about data protection principles, but not applying them to the staff member's job, not giving them those practical tips they actually need. Now I'm talking about a policy or a document that you will just have maybe on your intranet, but remember that regular short reminders, for example, just by email or in staff newsletters, can be really useful as well. And in particular around the phishing emails that I mentioned a while ago, always worth just keeping it in the kind of the forefront of staff members' mind that they need to make sure they're being vigilant around information security. So short, sweet reminders by email can be really, really effective in that sense. Next slide, please, Emma. Policies as well. So I mentioned that you've got this obligation to document your compliance with the GDPR principles. And that means that you should have something in writing showing how you are complying with the information security obligations under the GDPR. Also highly recommend having either a data breach policy or data breach procedure. This is a document that you would turn to, or the senior members of your organisation would turn to if you did have a data breach. So it would be a guidance document that would talk you through essentially the things to think about, because it can understandably be very stressful when you have a data breach. It's very easy to forget things. By all means, you know, pick up the phone to us and we can talk you through things, but having a document as well not only shows your compliance, but it's also useful in the heat of the moment, almost as a kind of checklist, but in more detail. In terms of kind of the detail of information security policies and information guidance, I've got a list here just in front of me of the key things I would expect you to be thinking about. So for example, what happens when staff members leave your employment? How are you making sure that you're getting all the personal data back from them? Because, you know, Vicki mentioned working from home. Well, even before COVID, people were working from home, maybe in the evenings, the weekend. So, you know, what happens if they've got notebooks with client data at home? How are you getting those back when they leave? Are staff members using their own devices, as Vicki mentioned? Have you got guidance for staff around that? We should also be explaining what to do around things like using public Wi-Fi. I appreciate your staff members will all very much be home-based at the moment, but if you do have staff who are out and about doing their jobs a lot, have you thought about the security of them using the public Wi-Fi in an airport, for example, that kind of thing? What measures of your IT team put in place to secure the personal data on whatever devices they're using? Also worth flagging with staff members the data protection obligation known as data minimization. Data minimization is basically just a techie way of saying only use the personal data you need for what you're doing. Only share the personal data that you need to share for the purpose of sharing it. And the great thing about this is that minimizes the risks if you do have a data breach, because the less information you're using, you know, the less information there is to be lost or stolen or whatever. So that's a really important thing to flag with staff members as well. Access permissions as well. I would expect your systems to be set up so that only the HR department, for example, can access HR records. Only the very senior management can access, you know, certain very sensitive information. access should be on a need-to-know basis. And one of the good things about access permissions is that it might protect you if you do fall victim to a scam. So let's say one of your junior staff members does accidentally click or download an attachment from a phishing email, and the hacker gets access to what they can access on the systems. Well, if you've got access permissions in place, it might prevent them from accessing the more sensitive data. So you're ring fencing, as it were, the more sensitive data. That's something your IT team needs to be thinking about. Another thing worth flagging with staff members in training and guidance is that there is actually a criminal offence under the Data Protection Act if staff members are using personal data for their own means. So if they're just being nosy, for example, and trying to access information they don't actually need, that can actually be a criminal offence. So worth flagging that with staff members. Also worth bearing in mind that you can take disciplinary action if they breach your policies and procedures. So it's worth putting that in the document itself as well. Next slide, please, Emma. Now, this is the bit where I was going to pass back to Vicki. Vicki, are you there?
I am, yes. I've turned my video off in the hope that it will assist in the sound issues I was having earlier. So
I can hear you perfectly, so that's brilliant.
Good, brilliant. Great. If we could have a slide, please, Emma, that'd be fab. Thank you. So I'm conscious of time, so I'm not going to go into this section in any great detail, but obviously I did mention earlier that if you're using video conferencing providers, for example, such as Zoom, you're inevitably going to be sharing some personal data with those organisations. And it's not just video conferencing, there are all kinds of new systems and document sharing software that you may be using. It's really important because you are sharing personal data in that context, that you think about how you're doing that and whether you have the right so very quickly, you need to work out whether you are both controllers or you're a controller and a processor relationship, and that depends on the level of control that the party has. You have to work out what you're sharing. So I've put some detail on the slides for you all about a bit about the processor relationship and whether you need to think about. But I think what I'll do is I'll sort of park that, pass back to Claire so she can go through the final section, and then if you've got any questions specifically or any particular software or that you're using and you want to know, are we a processor, are they a processor, how does that work, then please do ask a question at the end and I can give you a bit more detail. So Emma, sorry, I'm going to ask you to now skip ahead to Claire's bit if that's okay.
Brilliant. Thanks, Emma. Thanks, Vicki. So I'm just going to do a bit of a whistle stop on how to deal with data breaches. Now, we could do an entire webinar on how to deal with data breaches. So this is very much aimed at kind of a high level, just to kind of get you thinking about what you have in place as an organization around data breaches. I mentioned a moment ago that one of the documents I would expect you to have in place is a data breach policy and procedure, which outlines how you as an organization deal with data breaches, which runs you through all the things you need to be thinking about when you deal with a data breach. So again, this is just very, very high level over the next kind of 5 minutes. Next slide, please, Emma. Okay, so first of all, as I did at the start with what is personal data, I kind of need to explain, well, what is a personal data breach? Now, this is something that everybody at your organization should understand, because you need staff members to come forward if they even suspect there's been a data breach. So a personal data breach under the GDPR is a security incident that has affected the confidentiality, integrity, or availability of personal data. Now, often a huge amount of focus is put on confidentiality. When we think about a data breach that's being reported in the media, for example, we, our minds automatically go to, the well-known data breaches, British Airways, Talk, where there was basically data was stolen, as it were. So financial data may have been, I think, was stolen in the case of British Airways. So that was a breach of confidentiality. I want to focus a little bit on integrity and availability as well, because they're not quite so well known. but they do also count as a data breach. So integrity basically refers to, broadly speaking, the accuracy of personal data. So let's say you have a rogue employee that starts changing information on your system. So maybe changes client information, I don't know, just because out of revenge or something like that. That's an integrity breach because the personal data isn't up to date and it's not accurate. An availability breach is linked to what I was talking about earlier when I mentioned the ransomware attack. So availability is when you actually, the personal data is there, but you can't access it. And you can imagine in the case of something like the NHS, and I appreciate a lot of you will hold very sensitive information, not being able to get access to information could be really detrimental to the individuals who that personal data relates to. It could be quite high risk. So that's why the lack of availability of personal data also counts as a personal data breach. I've mentioned cyber attacks leading to personal data earlier, and that's certainly the case that if a password is compromised and the hacker gets access to your client database, that is a data breach. I was having a look a few weeks ago at the statistics on the Information Commissioner's Office website. Actually, it looks as though of the data breaches reported to them, the vast majority, or not the vast majority, but the majority are to do with human error. It's the sending an email to the wrong person. It's papers left in a public place, leaving them on the train when we all used to commute was so easy to do. It's the human error things, which I think I've noticed in particular has become almost worse since we've been working from home, because if you're working from home but also homeschooling your children, that's got to put an extra level of pressure on you. That means maybe you're not paying full attention to what you're doing, so it's so much easier to send the wrong attachment to someone, to send an email to the wrong person. On to the next slide, please, Emma. This is the final slide, just on the kind of the key things to be thinking about. But as I said, you should have much more detail in your data breach procedure. So first thing to do, if you are told about a data breach and you are responsible for dealing with data breach, so maybe you're the data protection officer, data protection lead at your organization, contain the breach. If a password is being compromised, change it immediately. You may need to bring in external IT expertise for this stage. So for example, if you have unfortunately been victim to a sophisticated phishing attack, you might want to bring in external expertise depending on the level of expertise you have internally. I appreciate if you're a larger organization, you should have that expertise internally, but smaller organizations may not. You then need to assess the risk and mitigate. So once you've done what you can to try and contain the breach, get the document back, for example, if you've left it on the train, that kind of thing, assess the risks and then mitigate those risks. So actually, what is the harm caused to the individuals? Is it distress? Could it be ID theft? Could it be financial loss? What are the risks? And then try and mitigate those as much as you can. The question around what the risks are leads directly into whether or not you need to report to the Information Commissioner's Office. So data breaches need to be reported within 72 hours where feasible to the ICO, unless it is unlikely that there are risks to individuals. So if you've managed to contain the breach, for example, you may not need to report, or if it's a low level data breach, you might need to report. But other breaches which present a risk to individuals, whether it be distress because confidential health information is being sent to the wrong person, whether it be a financial risk, whether it be information that could allow a hacker to impersonate someone. Those are the type of breaches where we'd be thinking, actually, do we need to report to the Information Commissioner's Office? The next question is, do you need to notify affected individuals? Now, sometimes you need to notify the affected individuals immediately. So in the case of, a phishing attack, you might want to tell all of your affected individuals to change their password straight away. You do legally need to notify the affected individuals, though, if there is a high risk to them caused by the breach. Think about whether you want to notify your insurers as well. So individuals can bring claims for compensation by So if they've been cause distress, for example, you may be aware that recently EasyJet had a breach. There is now a very large class action being brought against EasyJet because of that breach. So individuals are increasingly bringing compensation. So my recommendation is always to notify your insurers almost always if you have a breach, particularly one going to the ICO, because of that risk that individuals might bring a claim against you. Also consider whether you need to report Action Fraud, who are the fraud branch of the police, because like the National Cybersecurity Centre, they kind of build up a picture of cybersecurity in this country. So you're kind of helping everybody by notifying it to the police. But also, if you have a physical data breach, so you have a burglary, for example, obviously you'll be notifying the police in those situations as well. That really is a whistle-stop tour of how to deal with a data breach. There is a lot more to consider, which will be on a case-by-case basis. But I would just reiterate the importance of training to staff, because that prevents, hopefully may prevent a breach from happening in the first place, and prevention is always better than the cure. But also the importance of having this document in place that goes into detail about these different considerations. Brilliant. I'll pass back to Emma and Paul now, please. And hopefully Vicky's back as well for any questions.
Thank you very much, Claire. Thank you, Vicky. I thought that was fantastic, really insightful. But I'm not seeing any questions at the moment. So if you've got a question, please can you raise your hand physically or using the system? If you go to participants and raise your hand that way, or if you want to put anything on the chat. Stunned into silence. I don't know, Claire and Vicky, while we're waiting for any questions, perhaps, I think you each had maybe a question to ask or one of you, I think Vicky had a question to ask the audience, something that, actually, I'll throw something in there and then hand over to Vicky. Vicky, in your slides that you skipped over for the sake of time, there was going to be some stuff around data sharing, and that in itself I think could be a subject for another day. But there was a particularly interesting development last week with Privacy Shield. I don't know whether people have come across that. What's happened?
Yeah, so previously when, because as you're aware, if you are transferring personal data outside of the European Economic Area, you have to have specific safeguards in place. The idea being that whenever wherever you send your personal data, it's still covered by the protections that GDPR offers, because the opinion of Europe is that the GDPR is the best data protection regime in the world, and therefore all personal data should be protected by it. And we all know that there are issues, that Americans approach this very, very differently to the way that we do in Europe. And there used to be a system called the EU-US Privacy Shield, where organisations in the US could sign up to it, and they were effectively signing up to say that we are an organisation that takes data privacy seriously, and we will do certain things with the data and not do certain things with the data. And I think everybody sort of knew that it wasn't really that secure and it wasn't really the best way of doing it, but somebody actually challenged it, and it's now fallen. So we don't have that safeguard to rely on now if we're transferring data to America. So the question is, okay, well, we're using people like Google or MailChimp, for example, who have their servers in America. So we're transferring data to America. How do we do that securely? And there's a bit of a question mark over it. The practical answer is you need to make sure that there are model contractual clauses in place, and a bit like with the data process clause, that's probably going to be an add-on. And you may, if you're using processors, for example, say your payroll provider is based in the States, and they may well start to contact you and say, could you sign up to these additional clauses? And then you sign up to them, and that's fine. The issue with that is that the model clauses rely on what you're supposed to do is actually look at the organisation, look at the contractual clauses, which you can't amend, they are as they are, and assess whether or not you think that actually the organisation in America can comply with those clauses. And actually, on a practical level, I don't think they can, because of the way that the American sort of legal system and privacy system is set up. So it becomes a question of, do you just sign up to the clauses on the understanding that that's just what we have to do, or do we not contract with this particular company? Do we change our mind? Do we not use Google? I don't think that's necessarily, or Microsoft, whoever it happens to be. That's not always practical. So it's potentially a huge issue, and we're also expecting a challenge to the model contractual clauses in the very near future, more or less on that basis. So it's a sort of watch this space thing, I think. So from a data protection lawyer's perspective, it's incredibly interesting, as you might have guessed, because I'm waffling on about it, very excited about it. From your perspective, it's a case of, well, that's all very interesting, Vicki, but what do we do? I think the first step is to implement the model contractual clauses, and the second step is to keep an eye on the Information Commissioner's website, and because of course when we exit the EU, there'll be slightly different things that we need to think about, and we may have our own system in place eventually in the UK, but keep an eye on the ICO website for updates and guidance as to what they're expecting, and if you follow their guidance, they can't then come back and say, well, actually you should have done something different.
If I could, thank you, Vicki. I thought you weren't waffling. I thought that was a brilliant explanation after I just put you on that. Could I just add that if people want to keep an eye out for things, we produce a monthly update at the Farmer Law Brief, which some of you already receive, and Claire and Vicki do contribute from time to time, and no doubt there will be some contributions relating to this development. So watch this space. If anyone isn't yet signed up, please do let me know, and we can add you to the list. I'm seeing people, the hour is up. If anyone has got any more questions, please drop them to us. We'd be delighted to have them. We'll be in touch with you anyway. So you can let us know if you've got any questions as a follow-up. And just a reminder also that the immigration session, the impact from COVID and Brexit on immigration, is taking place this Thursday at 11 o'clock. So it just remains for me to thank everyone for coming, and particularly to Claire and Vicki for your excellent presentations, and to Emma in the background for making everything run smoothly. Thank you very much, everyone, and see you all soon.